Welcome to Nuts and Bolts of New Venture. This is our last session in the 2 weeks. And I just wanted to go back and revisit something we did at the first session, which is the kind of questions that we told you needed to know as an entrepreneur and how we might help you during the course. So the questions were, things like, how do I start? What do I do? What's the problem you're solving? How does the solution solve the problem? Who cares? Specifically, who cares? Bob Jones. How will I make money? What's the business or venture model once you found out that you have value for a customer? How long will it take to bring it to market? What are the things I'm going to need? Do I have to set up some sort of entity to do this in for investors? How do I keep people from stealing my ideas? That's the whole IP stuff we talked about. Do I need co-founders? And if so, what kind of arrangements do I have to do with them? And how do I negotiate with a whole variety of people in order to get the resources and people that you need to succeed? And how do I figure out what I don't know? Well, hopefully some of the questions we've asked made you think I don't know some of this stuff. What are the potholes in the road and how will I recognize them? And we pointed out that only 10% of new ventures succeed, and we hope we've helped you be in that 10%. And when you do launch, let us know. Which brings us to tonight, which is Virtual Inc. Yonald Chery. We introduced the Mimeo product the first night. And remember I said, well, why do we do this? Well, a bunch of reasons. One is it's an easy thing to understand. It's not like rocket science. It was a 100K entrant, and Yonald was on his third attempt at the 100K, then the 50K. It's an interesting story of the times, as you'll hear. I think the most important reason we do it is, if somebody comes in and says, I did this and I succeeded wildly, we all clap and say, great. But they don't tell you all the twists and turns and what they had to do with. And Yonald has been very generous over the years, telling all of the gory and good details of the Virtual Inc. story and later other companies that he's set up. And most importantly, Yonald is here tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Yonald. We'll have to switch the visual.
All right, great. Thank you. My name is Yonald Chery. I was one of the co-founders of Virtual Inc. And I've been doing this, coming back year after year now for almost, 25 years or so, telling the Virtual Inc. story. I guess you all have a copy of the original Virtual Inc. business plan that we did as students. I hope none of you followed that literally to the letter as a guide to how to write business plans, because we didn't know what we were doing at the time we were in the class, which is why we took a class like this to help us figure out how to go from there to actually building a business. My hope tonight really is to inform, educate, maybe have a little fun, right? Telling the whole story of the life cycle of Virtual Inc. for when I was involved a little bit later as well. We started off basically just like you, sitting in a class like this. In fact, over the years, I've started other businesses. I had a student in this class who sat where you're sitting, roughly, in 10-50. And he approached me after class, this was about 15 years ago, and said, hey, I want to start a business. Will you help me? And we started a business together, right? So what I love about this class, and I know in the age of COVID, it's very hard, and with all this distance learning, what's great about being in an environment like MIT, frankly, is the person physically or virtually to the left or right of you could be someone who you start a business with or could connect with through the lifetime of your career, right? So don't just look at me as a resource, but look at yourselves and one another as a resource as well in this class and for the years to come. And hopefully, I can provide some insight and entertain a little bit as well. Currently, I'm the Chief Technology Officer of a government contract company that does operational training and technology support for national security customers. I live in the DC area now. So I've gone from being an entrepreneur to working for GovCon. I know that sounds all the way under the spectrum. That's a whole other story I can tell folks offline. So why I tell the story? Part of it is I want for you to be more confident in understanding how to start a business. When I first started this business, it was very, very hard and very, very daunting. I came up as an engineer. I wasn't a management person or at all really had any sense about business. My whole background was technical in nature. And I felt like I didn't really have the confidence to go off and do this on my own. In fact, I entered the business plan contest 3 times. This is one of 3 ideas that I had over the course of the years at that point. I want you all to see the business plan as a first step. As we often say in my line of business, no plan survives contact with reality. So your whole business planning or approach has to be fluid, has to be evolving. But the process of writing a business plan is one where you will learn to ask the questions and have that open mindset where you're thinking, okay, I need to understand what I don't know. What's my sort of boundary of ignorance? What do I need to understand? What do I need to focus on? And so on. So it's not the document itself. The document is what results from that process where you start training yourself to think more critically. The document is important, it is, but really how you generate that document and how well you can do things like that over time is part of the point of the exercise, okay? I want to try to relate some of the lectures that you've heard over the last few nights here, and MIT, mens et manus, right? Mind and hands, theory and application. Some of what you've heard is theory, and I want to talk a bit about when I was starting off, what were we thinking? What was in our minds as theory? And then what happened? And then what might I do later in terms of practice going forward? Or what might I want to do the same? Right? So I wanted to give you a very candid sense of what happened through the life cycle of this business. What's interesting to me is that with MIT's brand, they can bring in all the Fortune 100 big CEOs, and they tell you these stories about their unicorn businesses as though that was a natural outcome, and often it isn't, and it's not the common case for a lot of entrepreneurs. Many entrepreneurs are serial entrepreneurs, folks who don't get it right the first time, but the second time they have another idea, or the third time another idea, and over time they're training themselves to understand how to be entrepreneurs and how to develop their venture ideas and fill gaps that they might have either in themselves or in the teams that they're trying to put together a particular business idea for. Big disclaimer. That's the fine print. There's a lot that goes into actually launching a business successfully, right? So again, there's not going to be any one book you read or any one lecture you watch or any one YouTube video you go see. There's no silver bullets for this. It's just, frankly, a lot of hard work. And sometimes, sometimes a mediocre idea with great execution wins, right? Better than a great idea with poor execution, right? So perseverance and persistence is really a factor that matters a lot. Now, I know you all have great ideas. I know some people looked at me and said, no, I'm looking down and saying, no, I don't have mediocre ideas. But the point is you're going to have a lot of challenges ahead as an entrepreneur, and you need to understand that it's not an easy path from where you are going forward from here to there. These are just hopefully some signposts of things to look out, and hopefully tell you some stories about things that did work out and things that I did that were specific to Virtual Inc., but hopefully you can abstract some concepts from that generally. All right, so a little bit about my background, as I mentioned. I did my undergraduate here in electrical engineering and computer science. I did my master's, and I almost finished a PhD, which means I don't have a PhD. I had left really to start Virtual Inc. Really toward the tail end of my doctorate. I had about 9 more months of work to do. That'll be a whole other story. I worked for a couple different companies in industry, mostly as an engineer. I worked for Hewlett-Packard Medical out in Waltham when it was open. I worked for HP Labs in Palo Alto. I did a number of tours there for a number of summers. Motorola, I was then recruited to go work for the Department of Defense 15 years ago or so. Out of that, I helped launch a venture capital firm in the DC area called Data Tribe, which invested in entrepreneurs coming out of government sector, trying to build technology that worked for government and commercial purposes. and I'm currently the CTO of a GovCon company as well. So I've had experience as an engineer, I've had experience as an entrepreneur, I've had experience as an investor, I've had experience in entrepreneurial environments, I've had experience in other environments that were laboratory related, and other experiences in, at the far end of the spectrum, working for government. So I hope to relay some of that as we go tonight through some of this talk. I've also started a couple companies. VirtualInc was the first of a few. After VirtualInc, I was recruited by Idealab, which was a venture incubator in their Boston office here. We launched a business called Newberry Networks, which did location tracking over Wi-Fi back in 2000. After that, the student who was sitting here in the class many years later, we launched a company called Mach3 Everyscape, which did 3D photogrammetry for indoor mapping, kind of what Google Street View is today. We actually sort of built Google Street View before Google did. And I started a calendaring company and worked for another entrepreneur that needed some help. So my experience and forte is largely around technology strategy, intellectual property strategy. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the strategic elements of that, not so much the nuts and bolts of filing a patents, because I think Joe may have hit some of that in the previous lecture. All right. I know we have some of the class online watching this virtually, so our TA is going to help use the raised hand feature as I ask some of the following questions. But part of this is to get the audience up and moving to make sure I see that people are engaged, right? So a little bit about you. How many of you are grad students? Grad students. Anybody online raising their hand? Okay. How many are undergrads? Okay, so mostly grad students. How many are School of Science? School of Engineering? Okay. School of Management? Oh, okay, so it's pretty, School of Architecture. Ah, all right. Did I miss anybody? Yes?
Design.
School of, okay, got it, good. How many from, just you? Okay. Well, good for representing. How many of you have a business idea right now? Okay, good. Is it based on MIT research or MIT theses? Nope. One is based on research. Anyone else? Okay, all right. How many of you have already started your business or started a business? Oh, okay, good. How many of you now have a business plan for their business idea? Oh, more hands should have gone up, but that's good. How many of you actually have either raised money or have been successful in getting a customer to pay for something? Oh, okay. Got some game in this room. How many of you are investors? One? Okay. I'm going to say some things about investors you might like, so just do that. How many of you have served in the military? Oh, interesting. Not just in the US military, but have done military service at some point. That's interesting. So when I give this talk in DC, a lot of hands go up, which is really interesting. How many of you are US citizens? How many of you are not US citizens? All right, good. All right, so we've got a lot of folks who've come to this country for the entrepreneurship and innovation and want to take advantage of that, and I think that's just great. Yeah, so I'm a second generation immigrant myself, so I think that's great. All right, how many of you are left-handed? Really? Wow. Usually about half the hands go up. Interesting. All right, I gotta watch out for this audience.
Change the talk now, right?
Yeah, I have to walk on that side of the room now. Yep. Oh, there is someone from Zoom left-handed? Okay. All right, so I want to jump into what the problem was. I was a teaching assistant for a class called 6111, which was a introduction to digital systems class taught in electrical engineering and computer science here. And you may have seen some of the students, well, I don't know if they still do, but used to have this briefcase with all sorts of electronics on it, and you would have very poor posture carrying this briefcase to the lab and back and forth, and you would wire up, literally, out of all sorts of electronic components, usually integrated circuits of some sort, and you, over the course of the 13 weeks, you spend the first six weeks learning digital design, automata theory, and some other aspects of building digital electronics, and then you spend the last 6.5 weeks building an electronic system, right? And it could be robotic, it could be video, it could be audio, whatever it was. You would build it up on this lab kit. And what I noticed was, in lecture at the end, in the last 6 weeks of the class, we would meet with students and they propose their project. And everyone wanted to build basically these cray supercomputers on these things, which they couldn't do. So a lot of the time the TAs would sit down and either cut down the scope of what they were trying to accomplish so they could do it, but also if they were dealing with audio or video or some other component that was outside the scope of the course, the TAs would sit down and help them build those interfaces. So we'd go to the whiteboard or chalkboard, draw out some schematics, work out some problem together, right? Maybe a timing diagram, maybe an actual schematic. And what would often happen is students would not spend time listening to me as the teaching assistant or other teaching assistants, but trying to copy the schematic, right? And often make a mistake in transcribing the schematic from the whiteboard to paper, and they go build something that they mistook notes on, right? And often, and as I went from a TA to head TA and instructing in this class, this, I realized, affected a quarter to a third of the students every semester. It was often because of some mistake in transcription of a schematic or a timing diagram or something technical, technical and graphical that was worked out at the board that they did not have an ability to get down on paper because they were focused on capturing it rather than listening to it and then recording the information afterwards, right? So they wasted time, right? They wasted time, and there were repeated meetings for TAs trying to debug what they were doing and realize, oh no, you didn't do this, or you didn't do that, right? So it was a huge time sink for me as a teaching assistant. So I entered in 94, yes, I'm a little older, the first concept, and I didn't know what a business plan was. I wrote it up like an IEEE transactions memo, like a little technical document, and I entitled it Encryption System, and I explained why this would be really good and how we could record the notes and the students can focus on the learning and not on the recording part of it, and it would improve their retention, it would improve the projects being able to work and so on. And what I got back was literally this sentence across the top of my document says, nice idea, where's the business plan, right? And like a typical techie, I was like, they're crazy. They just don't understand me, right? So then 2 years later, I met up with an undergrad friend of mine, Mike Dixon, who came back to Sloan, and we're sitting at the Thirsty Ear, and we're having a few beers and talking about stuff. And he was coming back, he wanted to go into the business plan and asked me if I had any ideas, and we talked about a couple ideas I had. And I mentioned the whole pen idea. And the next morning, he literally called me right away and said, I really think that idea you have could go somewhere. I get it. I totally get why you'd want that in the classroom, why you might want it in professional settings. How would it really be useful? And I was like, he's like, that pen thing, let's build a team, write a plan, and enter the contest. And I was like, okay, how do we do that? I had no idea. And you got to understand, back then, you have a lot more resources at your fingertips and disposal, both physically on campus and online, than I think we ever did literally just a couple decades ago, which is insane. But we went on to put this team together and to write this plan, and we won $10,000, which felt like we had won $1 million in terms of winnings, and then basically used that money to build our first prototype and launch the company. This was me in my dorm room in old Ashdown House, which was on the corner of Mass Ave and Mem Drive. I had a 10 by 12 room. During the day, I'd roll up my futon on one side. We had 3 desks in there. And we found this double E bench in the lobby of building 26 and carried it. It was cast iron steel. It weighed like 300 pounds. Carried it across Mass Ave, brought it to my dorm room, set it up. And we were literally building electronic prototypes over a series of couple months in my dorm room, right? So this is the proverbial doing it in your garage. I didn't have a garage. I had a dorm room. During the day, it was our lab, right? And back then, we had integrated circuit components with pins that would pop up. So I'd like to walk around barefoot when I'd get home, and I'd walk around my room and step on these things. So I had a lot of scars on the bottom of my foot from integrated circuits and stuff that we would drop on the floor. But this is how we got started, literally. And this is what the first prototype looked like. And what was interesting was, I think, Joe was, if you were not one of the judging team members, you were certainly a part of it. And I had heard that the reason, apparently, some of the judges didn't believe we could build this thing, right? And I was like, well, what do you mean you don't think I can build this thing? I was like, well, we just don't think it's possible. So I personally took that as a little insult, right? Never tell an MIT engineer they can't build something. And so we did. I was like, fine. I took the very same thing that I would use to teach my undergrads to build, and I used that as a platform, and that was the electronics we built literally from scratch back then. And we showed a very crude prototype in about 4 weeks that summer and brought the judges back one by one to say, yeah, this was definitely possible. Okay. So I don't have a demo, unfortunately, because it's a pain to travel with the Mimeo. But what it was, essentially, was a couple components, a device that you stuck on a physical whiteboard or chalkboard or pane of glass even, and it had 2 ultrasonic receivers on it. There was an electronic sleeve. You would put a marker pen in the sleeve, and as you wrote with the sleeve, it would transmit an ultrasonic and infrared signal that was used to triangulate with the device on the board. So as you wrote on the board, that was captured in real time and captured to a personal computer, right? This predates cell phone cameras, right? This predates, frankly, affordable cameras in many ways, things that we take for granted today. There were other whiteboard solutions, but they were very, very expensive, right? But the idea was not to focus on the surface, but to focus on the ink, more importantly, the virtual ink that we could capture and create to a personal computer. So, as I mentioned, you know, I was a TA for 6111. Recruited a fellow, my former undergrad classmate and my other grad student lab mates into doing this. We won first runner-up a few months later. Basically started as, you know, 5 guys in the dorm room. Now, I remember this day as clear as it was yesterday, September 30th, 97. We'd found we had a major competitor. But from there, we went on to raise $1 million in seed and angel money, developed a prototype, raised another $5 million, raised another $4 million after that, and then basically launched ahead of that competitor that we had discovered basically on day 1. So I tell this story because I want to go back and pause and talk about this competitor and about what happened during this early stage. So during that summer, as I mentioned, we had won in the contest, we built a prototype, and we started to recruit for other folks to help us build the company. And we found a fellow who was involved in building electronic whiteboards. There's an electronic whiteboard product I'll show in a second here called IBID. It was an IBID microtouch board. These were the solutions that existed back then. You had Panasonic, which would roll. There's a big plastic sheet of paper in here, and it would literally scroll behind and take a picture, and it'd come out on this really wrinkly fax thermal paper. You know, now they do a little inkjet printer. There was Softboard, which had 2 laser scanners up here. This was a very expensive device. You had Smartboard, which is still around as a company, and they built basically a large touchpad. And then you had this crazy thing from Xerox that was pioneering sort of all this technology before everyone else, like Xerox, was known to do at the time. And their systems were, you know, interactive rear projection whiteboards for 30 grand. But there was this company called IBID that had a 2-foot by 3-foot whiteboard, and with the director of marketing we had met, and we were recruiting him to be our CEO. And so he had set up a meeting with a company on the West Coast that was interested in what we were doing. And they were a company called EFI. They built the raster image processing engines for high-speed color laser copiers. And he thought, well, you know, we're capturing the ink. Maybe there's a collaboration where they do high-speed printing of stuff. They may want to be able to help render the material. I'm like, all right, we'll fly out to California and we'll do the demo. So what I did learn was I should probably get, you know, appropriate paperwork in place between the 2 companies. So I'd insisted on having a non-disclosure agreement in place beforehand. So we fly out there. It was myself, Mike Dixon, and our CEO candidate. And we go through the pitch with their VP of marketing. And we didn't bring the actual prototype because you can't get on the plane with something with all those wires hanging out. And we go through the pitch, and he says, you know, this is really interesting. I'm going to go get the CEO and have the CEO come down and see what you're doing, right? And I'm like, wow, this is awesome, right? The CEO's going to come down. This is a $500 million a year company going to come and talk to us. So the CEO comes down, very sort of stern, Napoleonic-looking face. He sits down, and we go through the whole pitch again, explaining what we're doing, what our vision for the product, and so on. And so he says, yeah, we've built one. I'm like, what do you mean you built one? He says, yeah, we're competitors to you. We have a system exactly like this as you describe. It's in the next room. Do you want to see it? And I said, oh, okay. I didn't realize that. no, I don't want to see it. I don't want to see any of your intellectual property. But that's interesting to know. I thought we came here with the intent of hopefully collaborating as partners. So then he starts asking questions. He says, well, how do you solve this problem? And I'm like, huh, okay. And then he asks another question. I said, well, how do you solve this problem? And I realized he starts asking a series of questions, and I realized they're still prototyping some things they didn't have a solution for. In their original system, their stylus was still tethered, and ours wasn't, right? The way that we had designed our system to be wireless and asynchronous. And so I realized, oh, okay, they haven't solved that problem. And they hadn't, so he starts asking more questions. And so I said, all right, let me have a little fun here. So I start asking questions. And I said, well, how do you solve this issue? And I started making stuff up, right? I said, well, you know, we notice when the whiteboard is under an air vent and the half of the whiteboard's cold and the other half is not so cold, the sound waves travel a different speed and the triangulation's off. And he's like, oh yeah, we solved that. And I'm like, oh, okay. Everything I was saying at that point, yeah, we've solved that, we've solved that, we solved that. So I realized, okay, there were a number of things. One, he didn't really understand deeply what was going on technology-wise, and there were some critical problems that they still had that were probably a year away from development. So this company was known for being very litigious and going after anyone that would try to threaten it commercially. In fact, he said so in the meeting. He said, well, if we decide to make you an offer to buy you out now, you'd be smart to take it because we crush everyone who tries to compete with us. And I said, well, you know what? Listen, I didn't know what to expect from today. Last week I was in a lab building this thing. Today I'm talking to you, CEO of a $500 million a year company. I have no idea what next week's going to bring, but I've enjoyed the meeting, and may the best man win. And we left, right? So my co-founder at the time and our CEO candidate, we're in the parking lot, and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe that. They're competitors. We're going to get crushed. This is a bad idea. And I was like, no. They're about a year away before finishing the design. What do you mean? I was like, well, you know that thing in the end, I was talking about the chilled air and all that. I kind of made all that up. And he was asking these questions, which indicates they haven't solved this problem. So we're sort of laughing about, you know, how we just kind of went in there and bluffed and figured out what was going on. And then I did have a cell phone. It was kind of a big old thing. And it rings. And it turns out it was the VP of marketing from the company who had invited us to come to this meeting. And he says, hey, I want to apologize to you guys. I know I invited you out here, potentially under, you know, not really honest pretenses, but there's two things I want to tell you. I was like, yeah. He says, well, I've been at this company 7 years, and I've never seen the CEO lose it as much as I did as after you guys left. He was so angry that you were so fearless in front of him. He says, I can't I find engineers like that who can talk to me and get stuff built and have no fear. So that was one. Second thing is, he tells me, I'm leaving next week to do something else for another company, but I want to help you guys raise money because you guys are going to make it. I was like, oh, great. So that was where our first $1 million came from 12 angel investors that formed a syndicate that this person who was the former VP of marketing for this other company as a potential competitor had helped orchestrate, right? So was that making lemonade out of lemons? Maybe. So I think part of what was interesting is a situation we went into where we had no idea what was going to come out. It had the potential to collapse completely, but frankly, just being confident and a little fearless and maybe a little sleuthing back and forth across the table there helped us to understand where they really were relative to what we were doing. The other thing I should also mention is it was a great wake-up call because I knew from the outset I had a competitor who literally told me, we will crush you in the meeting, right? So I realized, okay, this is not a game, or at least for them it's not a game, and now, you know, they will go after us unless we have all our ducks in a row from an intellectual property perspective. So I mentioned that story, and that would be core, that would be core to our survival. In fact, a lot of what I did as CTO involved a lot of intellectual property strategy. So I want to talk a bit about, I may skip some of this because I think you may have talked about the fundamentals of sort of the documents that you might want to have in place. I mention it only because, we needed to be incorporated, right? We wanted to have various agreements from the founders in place, right? We want to assign any intellectual property to the company. You want to have stock agreements, and these slides will be available for you guys afterwards as well. But the non-disclosure agreements that I talked about were critical for that first meeting because I made it really clear, anything we say in this meeting, unless you tell me it's protected, we're going to treat as essentially as public information. So follow up from that meeting, I wrote a letter that documented what I thought was protected, and they wrote what they thought was protected and sent it back and forth. And from my perspective, I was tight-lipped enough to not give them anything that would enable them to go build anything, but at least I had some sense from a business direction where they might go next. I'm going to skip this part because this is a little bit more advanced topic. Did we talk about provisional patents in the class as well? Okay, so I'll skip this as well, but provisional patents in this case were really critical to part of our success. And I'll mention it because at the time there was a loophole that was not exploited. In fact, my attorney wanted to write a paper about it at the time. I was like, no paper. We got to keep this secret. So at the time, I said, okay, I know they are litigious, which means the basis for any intellectual property strategy that they would want to come after us is patents. And they're probably filing provisional patents. Can we find out what they're filing? It's like, well, provisional patents used to be published after a certain period. And it used to be that they were published before the full applications were sent in for the subsequent things. So there's a window where things were public domain at that point. So we were able to identify their provisional patents, and what we did was research all the prior art associated with the things they were trying to patent. Because the provisional patent had the examiner, through a different attorney, we sent all that research to the examiner to say why all the claims in these applications would ultimately not be defensible, right? We did this for 3 or 4 filings that we found against them. So ultimately what that meant was we were doing the patent examiner's homework as to why they shouldn't grant the patents for those subsequent applications. And when those patents came out, they were essentially useless from a strategy perspective.
I have a question about...
Oh, quick question. Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Was there a question or?
Yeah, I have a question about the provisional patent thing that you mentioned.
A question about what now again?
Provisional patent.
Yes.
See, I did actually a provisional patent, but wasn't able to go for full regular patent. So
Okay.
I called the patent office and asked if they will make it public, the provisional patent content. They said no.
Yes, so this is the change.
Huh?
Yeah, this is the change. So this rule was not in effect until basically afterwards, right? So again,
Okay.
my point in bringing this up was to critically think about the threat was being sued in court for infringing a patent, which means they have to patent something, which means they have to file, which means they probably filed a provisional, which means how do we find out about that, right? So it was really trying to find that critical chain of decisions, that business decisions that they're going to make at some point, and see if I can get insight into that, right? And it turned out that they used to publish those applications, identifying who the examiner was, and that allowed us to cheat a little bit, right? So I bring these little stories up because there's nuggets of making sort of David and Goliath kind of moves where you don't have tons of lawyers as a startup, right? No investor is going to give you millions of dollars to go start a business so you can simply turn around and hire an army of lawyers. They want you to be building a team, a product, a market, a business, right? So you have to think creatively about, okay, well, with the few resources I have, how can I make the most impact, right? So again, I knew that IP was going to matter to them, and provisional patents that they were filing was going to be a way for us to gain insight. We filed, how many is that? That's, I forget. Whoop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 patents in the United States, right? Question? Oh, you're the first person in like a decade who's asked me this question. Great. So I'll tell a story. But actually, you had a question. I want to come back to you.
So, curious, how did you find the examiner? And how
So that's great. So we went through another attorney. We used there was the examiner's ID code, not the actual name, but the ID code and the area. So we wrote a cover letter that said we want to direct to this content, this stack of stuff that we had done, to the examiner who's researching these serial numbered cases that they're looking at, and that's how it went forward, right? Which you can't do easily anymore, right? Because you're right, usually the communications between the inventor and the patent office were all privileged, but because this was published at the time, we were able to sort of get some insight, right? And my attorney at the time says, no one's ever thought of that before. I'm like, yes, you know? So now, we started to, again, look at our product, not just from what it did for the consumer, but what would it take to build this system or to use these features. So we tried to protect as many enabling technologies of the product. And again, it's a hardware product, so you can't often protect everything, but you try to protect those things that are bottlenecks in the manufacturing process. So one of the bottlenecks was we wanted to build a stylus that we could write with. The pen goes through the stylus. So there was a ring, and the pen goes through it. So the marker makes contact with the board. But we want a transmitter that is circular in nature, that transmits all around in 360. Well, we were making these custom ultrasonic transmitters. And the way it was done is you'd have this piezoelectric material that you would fold around in a circle, and you would weld that material where it comes together. And there was only one company in the US that was an expert at having both producing this material and making custom sensors. So we went down to go visit how they make it, and we studied, all right, they bring the material from here to here, and we're like, oh, let's look at this welding thing. They showed us how they take the sheet of material, put it around this mandrel, and then they have a hammer that comes down and vibrates at an ultrasonic speed that melts that piece of the material to cause a seam, to have that piece weld into a circle. And then we mount that to make the transmitter. And we're like, does that come off the hammer? Oh, yeah, the mandrel? I was like, yeah. We're going to design a mandrel and the hammer custom. So another member of our team, Andrew Kelly, was a mechanical engineer, and he did that. He went off for a number of weeks, designed the optimal surface pattern and the optimal hammer shape so that it minimized the amount of material that got destroyed, because wherever it was welded, it no longer had ultrasonic properties. So you'd have good transmission everywhere except where that weld was. So he made it so that it was very narrow and a very good seam that held up when it was mounted. Why did this matter? A few months, when the product starts shipping, EFI noticed that our transmitter was really good in most directions. So they went back to that vendor and said, hey, we want to buy the sensor that they're using, right? And then we find out they're selling our sensor. Well, they're selling them the material, but they're using our mandrel design to finish the product for them. So we tell our in-house attorney, and she was really excited. Oh, I get to write another cease and desist letter. So we was like, oh, sorry, you, like ultrasonic material provider, can't use this thing that we gave you for anyone else. And it's patent pending, so you can't copy it, right? So again, what was interesting, and this is the case for many of these features, we went back and we looked, is what is the core essential element of the feature of the product that we're going to try to protect and make maybe the manufacturing process hard to copy, or something about an algorithm or a performance factor, or the fact that literally it was two sensors mounted together rather than being apart, and I'll explain that in a bit. So by doing that, we're able to tell EFI, cease and desist, not EFI, but anytime they try to ship one of these features, we'd write them a letter and say, hey, you're infringing on, once these patents came out, it was basically a leather a month where they had to go back and change what they were doing. Did I have the picture in here? I wanted to show you the picture. My mistake here. If I don't have the picture, please have the picture. Yes, okay. So when the first patent issued, and again, I'm dwelling on patents not for patent filing's sake, but as an example of a business decision to use patents as an asset and frankly, as a capability to thwart another set of business decisions that a competitor might make. So when the patent first issued, they put this figure on the front cover. Now, this design shows two sensors that are independently mounted in the upper and right and upper left corner of the board, going back to this logic unit and so on and to a computer. The final design that we built actually had these two things mounted together on a bar that would fold in half to be stored. And that was because we wanted to control the distance of the two things to get the accuracy to be, very, very good. But the actual patent didn't have that. It turns out that when EFI went to market, their product looked exactly like this. So our vice president of business development said, ooh, let's go visit some distributors. And we brought our two patents at that point that had come out. And we put them on the table, and we said, yes, we've got a good intellectual property strategy. You should stock our product because, as you can see, we put a lot of effort in the R&D, and we're putting more effort into the marketing. And we would show them, we would open the patent and show this page. They go, oh, that's EFI's, that's EFI's product. And I would say, no, it's not. If you look up here, right, it's all the inventors at Virtual Inc. And they're like, oh, well, if EFI is doing this and they're going to infringe on your patent, we don't want to stock their equipment, right? We don't want to be the distributor for their stuff because you're just going to sue them and their product's not going to sell and we're going to have wasted all that time. I'm like, well, that's your decision. We can't inform you on what business decision you want to do as a distributor because we couldn't tell them they were infringing because they weren't formally infringing, right? That would be a declaratory judgment sort of thing, right? Which would be bad for us to do. But we allowed them to infer, looking at our patents, that it might be a bad business strategy for them to carry the competitor's product because there may be litigation which would tie up the product in the channel that they didn't want to get involved with. So for the longest time, for a few months, EFI had the hardest time getting their product in distribution channels to get to retail. And they had no idea why. And it's because simply we went in and had conversations with the major account holders that were getting product into Micro Center, into Staples at the time, Office Max, who didn't want to carry their product because they were fearful of a lawsuit that would mean that very precious space on the shelves of these brick and mortar stores would be dedicated to a product that ultimately would be taken off the shelves. So again, a very non-traditional use of intellectual property assets as patents, but by understanding what in this case, the adversary, my competitor, was doing, figuring out new ways to use it as a tool in many, many ways. Was there a question? I thought I saw a hand up. Nope? Okay. So there are a lot of misconceptions about patents, and again, I'm not going to dwell on the filing or all this other stuff, but people say, well, if I have a patent, I can build my product and my business. Well, the good thing about writing a patent, to be honest, is you get to understand how other folks in an industry are thinking about this particular space, right? Because they're going to try to carve out something in the intellectual property landscape, and you get to see the inside of those inventors. You also get to see related spaces that you may not have realized that might have joined to yours. So we were focused on the whiteboard in our original approach, but we realized, oh, there's this whole area of pen computing that was emerging, right? And interactive displays that were emerging. I know, crazy, right? Interactive touch-sensitive displays? Wow, that's going to be the future, right? So all these different areas that I had not originally thought of, by doing the research, has helped me understand what was going to be out there. If you're building, depending on the nature of the product that you're building, right? So if you're doing work in biosciences or medical instrumentation or hardware products of the sort that I'm talking about, people may not want to invest in your business because they want to know, what is your intellectual property strategy, right? Are you infringing on anything, right? The area that you want to stake out, how are you going to defend it, right? Do you have freedom to operate in that space? What's your approach? I was not the first to invent this particular approach, but I did it in such a way that it navigated all the other approaches that had been tried in a way that allows us to sort of stake out a good amount of territory in that space, to the point where almost anyone doing anything with whiteboards today has to reference my patent, right? Now, investors, they wanted some assurance, so I spent a month literally researching all the patents that I could find and had a 3-inch thick binder. I must have read 400 patents, as I mentioned, in all those areas, pen computing and electronic whiteboards and so on. because the investors want to feel comfortable that you understand technically what's going on. And this applies to biotech. If you're doing drug discovery, same sort of thing. If you're building, if you're building a widget of any sort, can you build it? And what is your approach to defend that space? Again, as I mentioned, doing the research helps you become a domain expert in that particular area. Oh, patents are expensive. I don't have the time or money. Again, I did most of the prior art search myself. If you did that, if you hired a bunch of patent attorneys, that would have been $30,000, $40,000 to do. And frankly, they're not the investors, right? They're providing legal assistance in what is a legal process, essentially, right? You're, as the inventor, you have the technical insight or the business insight about where you want to go, right? Yeah, as I mentioned, try doing anything in bio or pharma without patents, and you'll be laughed out of the room because of the billions of dollars that often follow in the investment in the markets for these sorts of things. And I told you the story anyway, big companies will crush us anyway. So, yeah, question?
So if you find some patent from another company block you, can you license? If you find a patent in a different company block you, can you license it and use?
That's a great question. So, if you find something, you realize, okay, the area that I want to operate in I potentially might infringe on someone else's patent space, or patent claims, I should say. You can approach them and you can try to say, hey, I want to try to license your patent so that I have freedom to operate in a particular area. Sometimes you can do that. Sometimes a business may not want to do that, right? In which case, if they don't, you've got to think about how to work around it, right? Or you find out what they're interested in, and you go on the offensive, and you patent around what they're doing. So you force them into a cross-licensing situation, right? So they could choose not to license, but then you realize, okay, well, I've got these other things that you need too, we're just not gonna license as well, right? So most times I've heard people go off and try to engage licensing. People are usually amenable to that unless it's a core, patents in many cases are often filed, and not a lot of companies often exercise what they patent, unless it's in these market spaces we talked about. So the ability for a company to monetize its patents directly instead of investing more to necessarily productize them, in many cases companies will often sit down and at least have the conversation, especially if they have a licensing office, if they have a technology licensing office themselves, right? If the patents are coming out of government-funded research, very often you can get them licensed. If it's private sector, it will completely depend. Completely depend, yeah. Question? Was there the?
Grab the mic over there.
Sorry, this is so the folks online can hear the questions as well.
I've actually followed up with her question. So if your patent has to build upon other people's patent, how do you license it?
Yeah, again, you'd have to, well, the patent will show you at the time of the filing who submitted it, and you have to find to see if that has changed ownership. Sometimes patents will get sold. So ultimately, when you find the assignee, right, the entity that owns that patent, generally you contact their legal office, or if they have a technology licensing office, and inquire about licensing the patent. Now, sometimes you can, if they do that already, they'll have a licensing structure set up. If they don't, then it's really a business negotiation at that point, right? If it is core to their business, they may or may not want to license it. So it can really vary, right? Again, as I mentioned, if a company has a licensing office, chances are you can license it. MIT, as you know, everyone here is aware of the technology licensing office at MIT, right? So they typically cover intellectual property associated with sponsored research dollars, right? So because what I did here had no sponsored research dollars, the technology office issued a waiver saying, yeah, you're free and clear to do whatever you want. There's no licensing associated with MIT. But if you approach MIT about licensing some research, you'd sit down with them, have a negotiation. They want to understand your business strategy, how you're going to go to market. They want to know if you're the right person that they should do business with for licensing this particular patent, right? So the engagements will often vary, right, greatly. And as I said, there are a lot of companies that will patent a lot and then choose to really productize very little. So if what you're interested in is something that's not core to their business, and many times you can engage them and either do a revenue share or an outright licensing, But you'll have to see. What space, can I ask, are you interested in working? XRA, oh, like augmented reality. Okay, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, there's lots of different tech solutions there, from, acquisition systems and all sorts of algorithmic stuff, and, so there's a lot of things there that you could, in fact, I know someone you should talk to afterwards. Yeah, so we'll answer that question offline. All right. Yep. Zoom question?
Yeah, this is Ravi Ramakrishnan.
Yep.
What if I purchase a product or service that is part of a patent? Am I allowed to use it any way I like it? Even though it's based on a patent, but they sell a product. Say, for example, Intel sells chips. Do I have to pay anything if I use it in a different way than they are meant to be?
So if I understand the question, if you've licensed the patent, but you do something different than the patent licensing agreement covers, do you have to pay them for that? Is that the question?
No.
Oh.
Intel sells CPU processors, right? They have patents for that.
I'm having trouble hearing this.
I think he's saying if Intel has patents on microprocessors,
Yep.
do you have to pay a license fee to that? And I think the answer is no, you bought the product.
Yeah,
Unless you're using it in a system, that type of thing.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, precisely. That was the question. Excellent. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Another happy customer. All right, so what was it? So again, knowing that intellectual property was going to be key to the success of the business, there were a lot of questions that I over the years I've realized are important to ask when you're trying to at least pick out. Trying to pick out, in this case, right? And again, try not to be fixated on the fact that it's patents. The issue here is I needed someone from a business perspective that was an expert in this particular space that was going to be a service provider to me. So the question was, well, how do I pick that service provider? How do I know a good one from a bad one, right? And so from a patent perspective, what I realized, oh, this is interesting. And some of this applies beyond patents or patent attorneys. But the first thing that I noticed is the really good patent attorneys were asking me, tell me about your business, right? What are you trying to accomplish from a business perspective? What are your markets, right? What do you think the sales are going to be, right? How many products do you think you're going to sell in that market? Right? They were asking me good business questions because ultimately the patent was an enabling tool for my business to succeed. So they were asking the right questions to help me figure out, oh, okay, that's good. So as I was going around, and we must have interviewed over the course of my career, I don't know, 24 patent attorneys across 4 companies. I noticed that those asking me about the business were frankly a little bit more sophisticated in their approach to dealing with intellectual property. The other thing is really they would need to be a strategic intellectual property thinker, right? They weren't just focused on the mechanics of filing, but thinking, okay, what's the landscape of intellectual property look like in this particular area? Is it trending in a particular direction or toward a particular, is there a bottleneck from a technology perspective that we see everyone aiming toward and not being able to get at? Are there some, is there some constraint that makes it a little harder? Or is there some performance criteria that you could specify, right? So there were all sorts of strategic thinking approaches about the landscape, and then tactically within those landscapes of terrain that we could defend, which was very interesting, right? The other thing too is, I didn't want to deal with the partners all the time. I wanted to figure out who the junior partners were or the associates were, right? And this applies to a lot of different service providers. You meet with the boss, but you're going to be working day to day with someone who hopefully is a little bit more affordable from a billing perspective. So making sure they had quality associates, and then I got to meet them and talk technically with them or talk business with them and feel like, oh, okay, they got it, right? I'm going to be able to convey a lot of information. I'm going to get good questions and material back. And so, we picked a firm for Virtual Inc., Wilson Sonsini, that was based on the West Coast. So I would fly out once a quarter, and we would prepare all our applications, and we'd start filing things that way. But it turned out to be a really good match. Domain expertise, right? So if you're used to doing real estate, you might not necessarily know enough about, intellectual property filings for electronics, right? So you want to make sure that you're going to the right firm that has some depth in the area that you need to do, right? Someone, again, who's doing electronics may not be able to do biotech, right? So again, look to see if they have some prior experience in the space that would be of interest to you. And then, billing rates, right? So they make their money like any other service provider. They charge you by the hour. And so you want to make sure that you're maximizing your value getting out of that and not getting billed for the small stuff, right? And things where if you don't need to meet with the partner or the more expensive resource at that provider, then don't. Meet with whoever it is that help you get stuff done. So I used to travel out to meet our attorneys because we had by the time we got through this process, we had 3 attorneys working with us. So it was better for me to fly out and out to the West Coast, make a vacation out of it, and meet with them for a day or two, than having to fly out the attorneys and put them up for a couple days out here. So again, to summarize IP strategy, initially the only reason I was interested in patents was because of the threat sitting across the table from that competitor, but also I thought I only needed patents for to satisfy the investors, because they kept asking me what my, they were asking me, what's the IP position? And I was like, what do you mean, like on the network? Like, no. What is your intellectual property position? I didn't even know what IP stood for at the time, right? I knew one definition of IP, it was not what they were talking about, right? Again, the IP strategy process was really instrumental to how we developed the product and, frankly, the go-to-market strategy, as I mentioned, in terms of blocking and tackling our potential competitor in the market space. On this front, what I do differently? Not a whole lot, to be honest. I think we aggressively understood the threat. We looked at as many critical decisions where intellectual property favored the business and try to go after those things. And then again, this is it, right? Whatever your core advantage is, if it turns out to be intellectual property, then you want to figure out how to best protect it and grow it and defend it. Now, one of the things, this is peculiar to IP, but one of the things that if you promote a culture of invention in your company, one of the things that you want to do is record your notes, right? You want to keep notebooks of things to document the date of conception of various things, right? So culturally, one of the things we did in the very beginning was we got lab notebooks with the Virtual Ink logo, and we handed them out to all the engineers, right? And it was sort of this point of pride that everyone here is potentially an inventor, right? And we had not all those things was I the only inventor, right? Some other folks came up with some of those ideas, or we had follow-on things that we patented in the UK. But it was a really good way to promote a culture of innovation, get everyone involved who was at least in the process of synthesizing it from a development perspective to feel like they were part of the team. And so, and then we'd have once a month we'd have pizza parties and we would sign one another's notebooks, and talk about it. And then I, as CTO, would read invention disclosures month to month and see, is there anything interesting that we want to patent here that fits in our product strategy? And a few of those things from line engineers were interesting enough where it's like, yep, let's go patent that. And so the engineer got to have their name on a patent as well, and that was very exciting for them. Right? So again, don't just think that limited to intellectual property. The same idea could go with product development, it can go with marketing, right? It can go, the idea that you want to have a culture where everyone feels that they're able to weigh in potentially or contribute. It's not so much weigh in so that they have a say, but contribute to the advancement of whatever you might be doing from a business development perspective, a sales perspective, a marketing perspective. You may want to think about how you might do that equivalently. I think I talked about, so this is, yeah, I mentioned that before. Okay, so this is the part where I show you more than most entrepreneurs probably would normally about the whole life cycle of a business, right? So I'm going to talk in detail about the investment life cycle and the milestones and things that happen at Virtual Ink. Excuse me. Usually we don't do this remote, so I'm asking folks not to record this because I do name names, I do sort of show openly some things, and this is part of the point of being in the class here in person, is to see this sort of stuff. So,
we are recording, but I edit things out before we release it, so this
fantastic.
will not appear.
So all of you in the class are hopefully going to get a little treat here. All right, so all right, we're getting squeezed down, but value is growing, and I'm feeling like, okay, this is going in the right direction. All right. This is where it starts to get a little crazy, okay? We now have orders for 35,000 Mimeos, representing roughly 19 million in revenue. This is for a hardware business, right? I mean, back then, you may not even remember what this is, but there used to be this company called iOmega. They made a zip drive. Yeah, you're all looking at me like I have no idea what we're talking about. Okay, so, you know, people were comparing us at the time. This is like the zip drive of, you know, of classrooms and so on in terms of the market opportunity for this. So we raised $47 million in one round. Let me say that again. We raised $47 million in this round. $47 million, if you looked at the top 10 investments made in that 10-year period, half of those businesses were biotech, right? This was an insane amount of money to raise at all, right, at that time. Question?
Yeah, question from Zoom. The question was, were the founders taking a salary at any time during the
Yes, so the founders, up to this stage, there was no salary. Once we brought a little bit of money, we took a little bit of salary, and then as we joined full time, yeah, we were all on salary at that point. Okay, that was a good question. So $47 million. Now, at this point, we actually had 2 term sheets, and I forget if I hit this next, but if I do, it's fine. I'll tell the story here now. One term sheet had us valued at $70 million, and said, okay, if we'll value at $70 million, and it's and that's basically it. This term sheet said, all right, we'll give you $47 million, and we'll value you at 80, and for every, I forget if it was every 10 million you have in addition, for every million in additional sales, we'll actually go back and change this valuation. So they had an incentive up that if we really hit our numbers well, they would change the pre-money valuation on this up to a year later, right? I was like, wow, okay. So I was like, oh, we're getting diluted. You know, I'm gone from 22% to 9%. Oh, okay. I'm going to stop complaining, right? So I'm seeing my equity value really skyrocket very quickly at this point, right? And the lead investor at the time was Bear Stearns, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But they were actually a really good investor because we thought at this point we're probably going to be acquired or maybe even go public. You know, that's sort of the discussion that was happening around the table. And again, as founders, you know, now we're down to roughly as a group to where I was initially on my own from a percentage perspective, but the value was, you know, frankly, nonlinear from there. All right, like ooh and ah a little bit later, but bear with me because this is not pretty, this part. All right.
Yonald, did you have an independent board member or two early on?
We had one independent board member who was a very successful entrepreneur, but also did not, I think, hold us to account to our own board, to our own business plan.
Yeah, it's a key thing if you get a good independent board member or two working.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was myself, the CEO, all the investors, and one outsider. Right. So it wasn't a balanced voice in that sense. You know, this story is not uncommon, right? In the sense of what can happen to a lot of startups, right? There's a lot of moving parts when you're trying to build a business, and my purpose in showing you this is some insight about what that roller coaster can look like, and how some critical decisions were not made the right way at the right time. And some of those, Andy Grove talks about inflection points, right? In Only the Paranoid Survive. Have any of you read that? No? Oh, Andy Grove, co-founder of Intel, Only the Paranoid Survive. He talks about strategic inflection points, which I've interpreted as decision points in your business, but if you're not aware about them, they're essentially irreversible, and they, you know, your business at some level will follow a certain trajectory, right? There were a series of strategic inflection points in our business that we did not pay attention to, right? Chief among them was the sales plan, right? And the sales model and the sales approach for what we were doing. Other decisions we did really well from an IP perspective, right? All right, so I want to talk a bit about sort of what this looks like from a pie, right? So if you took at the average business, right, 3 founders, you start with a small thing like we did, $100 in value, right? You work to build value, so the founders own 100% of the thing, you're building more value. You raise maybe $5 million, right? If you're doing a typical venture thing, that means usually the Series A holders get half the business, in many cases today, right? Now, often what they require you to do is an option pool, which they carve out of your half, right? Not out of their half. So one of the things I saw an entrepreneur do at MIT, who was in this class, which I thought was very creative, and again, you'd have to talk to an attorney to see if this can be done, is the founders, in his case, own the option pool, and they would replenish the pool as needed. So what does that mean? Because you carve out this amount here, it's not actually part of the cap table. So if the company were sold the next day, these folks would have 66%, and the founders would have a third net on a share issued basis, right? So it can be even worse than you think in many cases. All right, so more blood, sweat, and tears. You're building the business. Maybe you raise another round of financing as a Series B, right? Success, you have an exit. All right, great, right? But wait, now at the time, there was a term called participating preferred, which allowed the investors to basically extract more value out of the business, usually at your expense. Then they'd be accumulating dividends. Then there's interest that's charged as part of these loans, part of these funding rounds, right? Then you have multiple founders, so then your slice gets even smaller. And then taxes, right? So all this stuff, right? When you do venture financing, you think it's a lot of money, but in the end, you're getting a small slice of what you hope is a very large pie. But the dynamics of making it very large means your business may have to take on a shape and a growth rate that may or may not fit your sector or your particular product or a number of other factors, right? That may not be in your control. Was there a quick question? I think I saw a hand up here. Yep. Sorry? Yeah, you can. Thank you for asking. So I know I beat up on VCs in this talk, but their life from an investor perspective is not easy either. So I wanted to quickly walk through why it is that venture capitalists have so little time and why getting your pitch is so important, right? So if you look at a typical fund, and frankly, some of these numbers are fairly small today, right? Let's say a typical venture capital fund, $500,000 under management, 2% operating fee, which means they take 2% of that to run the office itself. 5 partners, and they do 7 investments per year per partner, maybe, and 5 investments, and $5 million chunks, right? If you have $500 million, you can't write checks for $100,000, $200,000. You've been writing thousands of checks for years, right? So the economics of the business means they have to put a certain amount of money to work each time, right? And the bigger the check, reasonably so, right size for the business is the thing that they want to do, right? Because they got to put $500 million in investments in what might be a 7-year fund or a 10-year fund, I don't know, but they got to get that money invested within 3 years. Because what do? Then they go off and raise the next fund and the next fund, so that by the time those companies have grown and matured in that portfolio, those things can exit, right? So they've got to put all that money to work as quickly as possible, which means big checks. They've got to write bigger and bigger checks the larger and larger these funds get. So I know a lot of VCs, right? They spend much more than this every 18 months, right? I put about 4 weeks, it's frankly months, raising money to fund their capital, their particular fund. A bunch of them go to conferences. Most of them I know go to 2-3 major conferences a year, right? A lot of them, in my experience, seem to take the month of August off, so don't go fundraising during August. That may be the most valuable piece of information I give you today. So let's say they sit on the boards of 7 companies, and they have 4 or 5 board meetings a year. So that means 35 board meetings a year they're going to, right? So every week, they're coming or going to a board meeting, which may not be which is why sometimes they invest regionally, because 35 plane trips a year just for board meetings is a lot to manage, right? And then internally, they got to run their business, right? So there's a partner call. Don't try to call a VC first thing Monday morning, because they're all on their, their internal call, going through their portfolio. And, they probably get 1,000 plans a year per partner that get, unsolicited coming through the door, right? So they're going to reject 99% of those because they just don't have the time, right? So, they reserve maybe about effectively 1.5 workday to hear real pitches, right? In that top 2%, which is why you got 30 seconds, right? Because they are literally this busy constantly, right? So I know we spend a lot of time talking about the pitch. This is looking at it from their side. Well, why do I have to reduce my grand idea in business to just, a 90-second pitch? That's the maximum attention span. You got to basically grab them in that time period. Okay. I would say if you don't have prior relationship with an investor, getting a crisp articulation of your business model and your product offering and the advantage and all that is going to matter a lot, right? Yes, team matters. Team does matter, right? And again, Y Combinator is earlier stage than sort of what I'm talking about generically here, right? So I'm talking about if you're going to go meet an investor who's going to write a check north of $3, $4, $5 million, this is sort of the structure of their daily life, to be honest, right? All right, I'm going to quickly go through this because we've got half an hour. So I would say that as you go to more serious institutional investors, you've got to have market validation, and and the more you can get pre-sales or customers lined up articulating a story as to why, in their voice, your offering is so much better than anything out there in the market, that helps, right? Every entrepreneur loves their product or service. You go in and you say, well, I've got these 10 customers lined up, and if I build this, they will pay this much. That tells a very different story. I believe Bob Jones covered this, right? Covers this every year quite well, right? As I mentioned, the option pool size can be a negotiating tactic to set the pre-money value, right? So if you've got to create an option pool, you want an option pool that makes sense, right? In our case, building a 25% option pool was really large, right? I don't remember, it took like 2 or 3 years to fully exercise that option pool, all at our expense. And what I've done since is I will negotiate and say, over the next 2 years, here's what my org chart will look like. Here's how I plan to spend those options through that organization. And all these options at these various times amount to this amount of equity. In many cases, I've been able to get it down from 25% to 17 or 18%, right? I'm willing as a founder to admit, yes, I've got to motivate some folks, but as we take this ride together as investors, if we have to plus up that option pool later, it's going to come out of all of us, right? Investors don't like that generally. They want the entrepreneur to suffer that dilution, but that can be a little bit too much. Angels versus VCs, that greatly depends on the amount of money. If you can take a little bit of money early on and work with an angel investor, right, who understands the market space, that may be appropriate for your size of business and stage of business, right? VCs generally mean, what you don't want to do is raise venture capital to go prove, the more that you have risk in the sense that no one's either built this service or product before, or it's in a new market space and so on, the more unknown unknowns from that perspective, you're adding a lot of risk to yourself, right? And the more that you can figure that out and delay taking much larger checks, the more stable the more stable you'll be as a founder from an equity perspective going forward, and the better negotiating power you'll have as well, right? Current business I'm in now, the 2 founders took no money. They raised it all from contracts and owned 100%. And we only recently did some outside private equity money purely for growth, right? Phenomenal strategy to be able to control their destiny for many years, right? Again, not everyone can do that, but they were very fortunate in being able to do it. I'll talk more about this in a bit, hopefully. If you're meeting with investors and you don't get a yes after 2 meetings, probably want to move on to talk to different investors because your time is valuable too, right? And I'll talk a bit, I think I have a chart that explains this later. And then the other thing is, well, people ask, how do I meet investors, right? Certainly cold calling or meeting through the alumni network of MIT, is I think a far superior method, right? Introductions or you're leveraging the MIT brand is going to open doors for you, right? But also, talking to alumni from MIT who might be at the fund, right? Going on LinkedIn today, which you can do, and rather than cold calling people and find out and talk to them so that they're somewhat predisposed to listen to an MIT student, that'd be great. Service professionals, right? Your attorneys, your bankers, your accountants, they all work in that community. They have other customers too. They might be able to make introductions to other investors or frankly other service providers, right? And then other industry forums and so on that are in the MIT orbit. I mentioned this before, people invest locally. I still think it's the case. Boston is great for life sciences. Tech may or may not be on the rise again, and don't try to raise money in August. All right, so this is a chart for the business that I started with a student that was in this class 15 years ago. And what I did is I recorded the amount of time I met with each investor, right? So you can see along the bottom here, each bar represents a different investor, and these are the number of hours of meeting time. So for every hour of meeting time, there's probably 1 to 1.5 hours of prep time, right? Getting the slides, setting up the call, scheduling the thing, so on and so forth, right? So what I noticed is there were some interesting patterns that emerged. Right off the bat, I went from 31 people to about 20, where they would say, oh, it's interesting, but not our cup of tea, right? We're not interested in that. That set whittled down, pretty quickly to about 7. We said, oh, come back. Well, we'll have a more detailed conversation, right? Then that whittled down to about 4 or 5 that said, oh, we think this is really interesting, right? And so they're thinking about it internally. This is now weeks are going by. And now we'll get to a point where after about 7 hours, I want to get a draft term sheet, right? This is where I want to figure out, okay, put some terms in front of us. Now, as an entrepreneur, I want to be at this stage with ideally a couple different investors so I have choice, right? I can start, from my perspective, trying to dictate terms or trying to negotiate the terms back and forth. Most cases, there'll be a no-shop clause on the term sheet, which means you can't reveal the contents to other people and shop them around overtly, right? So you get the deals in and you try to figure out, okay, where might I have leverage with different investors, or figure out the pluses and minuses of working with the different investors, as I mentioned before, right? Market, money, management. All right, and then you get to a point where hopefully you get a signed term sheet like I did at this case. Now, this bar, well, you'll see shortly here, what was interesting is I had some others on the side who were also serious investors. They weren't going to invest. I think they got to a point where they were invest, but they asked really good questions, and talking to them helped refine my story and my market pitch. So sometimes, you want to limit the number of people you're talking to beyond 3 to 4 hours of actual face time, right? Now, what ended up happening is these others were also helpful for a similar reason, right? They made introductions to one another. But this is what I wanted to warn people about. I spent a lot of time with this one particular investor where it was meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, right? And again, what seems like 7 hours ended up being, frankly, scores of hours of physical meetings and emails and so on. And I was wondering, okay, well, why is this happening? And it turned out that they were interested in what they thought was a competing technology, and they were using me to vet and understand the market perspective. And once I realized that was going on, I was like, all right, I'm done. I'm taking the other term sheet, right? So that was a little frustrating. But beware, your time is valuable too. Don't be afraid to say no. In fact, I remember, finally when I said, okay, well, are we at a point yet where, you think you'll be able to get a term sheet to us? He says, well, we'd like you to meet with this other person, right? And I'm like, well, I don't think that's going to really work for us. I think we're just going to move on with someone else. And they're like, oh, no, wait. Oh, we'll rush this and so on. So suddenly, sometimes saying no can trigger, a little bit more of an interest. Or at least you'll find out, are they really interested or not? Are they going to walk away from the deal? Or are they going to hurry up and try to get in because they don't want someone else to beat them to it? This one, this particular term sheet was three months. And I think Joe had challenged me in class. He's like, are you going to close this thing or not? And so I brought, I think on the last lecture, I brought the deposit slip of the money that they had invested. I was like, I did it. All right, so again, manage your time and don't be afraid to say no. I mentioned, yeah, so some of this now is well understood, right? The idea of incubators, doing some work for customers for hire. You know, you've heard the phrase friend, families, and fools in the class earlier, people who invest early on. Grant money, I think, is really a good, you know, if it's possible. That link may not work anymore, but the idea of using grant money, which is, you know, there's no dilutive, there's no equity exchange there, right? Someone's giving you free money. Now, there are other clauses with that you may not like that might, you know, assign some IP or share some IP rights. The funding cycles could take too long to get done, given this life cycle of business. So sometimes some of these grant approaches may or may not fit your particular business. They might be interesting if you're, you know, if you've got a day job and you're doing this thing on the side and you can extend your runway with grants, it could be of interest, right? Again, prove the market viability, as I mentioned earlier, right? Early adopters, we talked about paying customers. Ask those customers what the value they see in your product and service. And then the earlier you can show some growth from a sales perspective, the better, right? Because you're de-risking the investment approach, right? It's great that if you're talking to investors of a long period of time and they give you a call, hey, just wanted to check in, and you're like, nope, don't need the money anymore. I've got enough revenue coming in from customers, right? They're going to feel like they lost out getting on the boat investing early on, right? Question again, how many what?
How many models or versions of the product you have?
Yes. So I forget if by this point we had the basic Mimeo, we had a sort of an executive model Mimeo that was silver in color, and then we had a excuse me, a Mimeo direct print, so it didn't go to the computer, but it went to an inkjet printer. So you'd press print, so you have a copyboard kind of capability. So I think we had, and then we had some software products that did handwriting recognition and image recognition. So you could draw a calculator on the whiteboard and then hit the numbers, and the computer would talk and do the math as you hit on the whiteboard, right? You could draw a piano keyboard on the whiteboard or stick a piano keyboard, tell it where it was, and play musical instruments on the board, right? These are all things we got patents for, right? So there were some hardware features. I think there were 3 different varieties and a couple software extensions that we had, right? In fact, let me tell this, I don't tell this story often, but this is a good one. So every time we would talk to sales folks on our team, they would come back and say, you gotta have handwriting recognition. You gotta have handwriting recognition. It's like, oh, really? Yeah, you gotta have handwriting recognition. Why? Well, people keep asking about it. I'm like, oh. So what did we do? We licensed 3 different handwriting recognitions. So we could look at Roman characters, we could look at Japanese kanji characters, and I forget, there were 3 different character sets that we could recognize. So as you wrote, it could convert, because we capture stroke order, right, which for some character sets that matters, we were able, as opposed to taking a picture at the time, we could turn that virtual ink into characters, right? So we had built, frankly, one of the best character recognition engines that went from stroke order into characters. You want to know how many we sold? 0, right? And the reason was the salespeople, when they would go demo the product, customers would say, oh, this is neat. Does it do character recognition? And like, no, but we'll take that back. So they were taking back market feedback, but they never asked, well, how much would you pay for character recognition, right? Would you use it, right? The most important question if you're a salesperson, what do you want to do with it? They were listening to feedback, but the feedback was decontextualized in the sense that the customer didn't explain how much skin they would put in the game for that, right? Oh, if I have to pay for it, no, I don't really need it. But it'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? I'm like, yeah, after we spend $1.5 million developing it, right? Question? Okay, so the question was the sales channel, how diverse was it? And then also, were we doing direct sales to schools or universities? So I believe we did some direct sales, but it was very, very small. The sales strategy was around selling to distributors who sold to retail, and a couple partnerships So we did a partnership with Dell, where they would sell laptops and we would sell Mimios, and it was a classroom system that we would try to sell that way. I don't remember what the sales numbers were on that. But the idea was largely sell to distributors who would then sell to retail, but we were not going very much direct. We did have some direct, but not a whole lot. Right. Questions?
Yep, so the question is, how do you think about marketing for a product that's super new to the market, like yours, and companies may not understand its place? And does that generally help, or should the capital be better allocated elsewhere?
So if you're building a new product either building a new category or an untested, you're building a product where no one's built this particular type of thing before or offered this particular service, I think it's very critical to find not just innovators, but early adopters and maybe even some early mainstream customers to understand the trajectory of where your product has to go, right? A lot's been done in this whole sort of lean startup initiative that talks about minimally viable product and finding that product market fit. Same topics we covered in this class, right? You want to figure out, you want to try to understand what the core problem the customers have and make sure that you're focusing on that first in the embodiment of your product or offering, right? So focusing on that early is the most important thing, right? All the other stuff I would say it depends exactly on what you're doing, but by and large, finding that product market fit is absolutely critical, right? And getting customers as early as possible involved helps. Because you find out, well, how are they going to consume the product? How are they going to use the product? Where are they going to buy it? What are they trying to achieve, right? And you find out other features, other wants, other needs, other adjacent markets, right? You find out the whole ecosystem, what it would take to get your product or service in the hands of the customer, what it would take to get from A to B. This is like a multi-part question. All right, let's start back. So 97, the prototype we built in 97 was really to try to help to figure out and navigate the freedom to operate aspect of things, right? So as I mentioned, the other competitor, they hadn't done certain things that we had done. So we wanted to show, okay, do we understand enough of the architecture of this thing to build it? We did, but that was in a lab environment, right? So from I don't know if you've heard the term technology readiness level, right? This was a very low technology readiness level on that scale, right? It was a benchtop prototype. To go from that to something that would survive as a consumer product was a very wide gap. And that was probably 3 more models of prototyping during that period. Some of that involved making custom molds for plastics and for plastic injection, very capital intensive aspect. Custom ultrasonic sensors I mentioned earlier, right? Very capital intensive. We ended up figuring out that we were spending $4 per ultrasonic receiver sensor, and then we found out that we could use a $5 sensor that went in cell phones, the microphone in cell phones. When you drilled the hole 0.3 millimeters wider, it would receive perfectly at the frequency we needed. So we were literally doing exercises like this to figure out how to bring costs out of the product. So things like that in terms of improving the prototype mattered. IP patents were treated as a G&A expense. It was really under sort of legal expenses. We didn't really think about it as as an asset in the way I think that you're asking me about. But it was a pretty capital intensive exercise because we had to get tooling, testing infrastructure. We had manufacturing in a couple different places, assembly in another, testing happening back at our facility. The logistics of all that was also very capital intensive. So building a physical thing means moving atoms around and making sure those atoms are going to be resilient and so on. So the product we wanted to satisfy a drop test, right? So we would drop the product from 6 feet because it would hang on the whiteboard. What happens if it drops, right? It can't break in 1,000 pieces when it drops. So that means you got to re-engineer the thing to figure out how do we make the thing so it bounces or it absorbs shock, right? All these things you never think about when you're on the bench, and you're like, oh yeah, it works. Well, take that and drop it on the floor. Does it work? No, it's not going to work, right? So, so those are the series of prototyping steps. All right, so you asked about the original prototype, the series of prototype steps, whether it was CapEx, I mentioned that was expensed, and one more question you had? That's a good question. So in our case, because we were doing this, this distribution model, right? We needed folks who understood the mechanics of wholesale distribution and how they sold to retail, right? So it mattered that folks had experience with that. So we hired someone who understood that distribution model, right? Even in that case, the sales folks would still go off and meet with the distributors and the retail buyers and so on to try to generate demand from the wholesalers. So that was the model then, right? It was a push. It was trying to push in that sense and generate pull at the same time. So that was hard because we were we had a fiduciary duty to do what we said we were going to do and raise the money, which was to go off and productize the plan and to build a current roadmap of products. The business, since I had left, there were other adjacent products that they started to sell that were for classroom support, that were used when you use the Mimeo, when you're a voting system, a way for in the classroom, other tools, other software products. Those things came later because we needed the platform of the actual capture product, the end capture product first. Okay. All right. So to summarize for the financial and fundraising we thought in the original business plan, $3 million and we'll get to profitability. Oh no, right? This is why I caution everyone, and Joe cautions everyone, I hope, not to read the original Virtual Inc. business plan as a blueprint for success, right? We were students just like you sitting in that chair with not knowing anything more going into the contest. $3 million did not bring us to profitability. What we learned, prototypes and demos and early users made a very big difference in the crafting of the product itself. And then I was an educator, right? The reason I built this product or came up with this concept was I wanted to teach more effectively. And our marketing strategy veered from that. We were selling to knowledge worker professionals, to folks who were consultants, people who were generating content in a shared meaning experience and needed to record stuff in those settings, when really it was really schools all along that was the original intent and ended up being the original, the viable market for this product, right? Right. From a company perspective, the company's still around, right? They are one of the top 3 vendors of electronic whiteboarding solutions for education today. I'm proud of that. I mean, I remember we used to get letters from kids. I'll never forget this. It's going to make me a little emotional thinking about it. But we would get letters from kids saying, hey, I'm visually impaired, and we got a Mimeo in my school, and we got the program, the laptop from Dell, and through your program, I used to get B's and C's because I couldn't see the whiteboard, but now as the teacher writes on the whiteboard, the chalkboard, it goes to my computer and I can see it and I'm getting A's and B's. And I'm thinking, okay, that's awesome, right? That made a huge impact in this kid's life, right? And we would get letters like that all the time, right? From students, from educators, and I realized, okay, that was really sort of what I wanted to have happen as an inventor and as someone who wanted to solve that problem so that people could learn. But I never thought it would be used in the case for a kid who had, an impairment, but have them feel like they were engaged fully in the educational experience. So that was personally, it was very enriching. Oh, so yeah, so we would have, because we had patents on doing this whole virtual whiteboard stuff, after 9/11, no one was really traveling for a bit. And the same could be said, frankly, during COVID. So we had developed all this technology so that people could have a shared virtual whiteboard. You have a projector in one place, a projector in another place, and you're all writing, because that's what's missing when you're in a virtual environment and you're not, you could be in the same time or same space, or same time and same space when you have an actual meeting, right? Same conference room, same whiteboard. Virtualizing that so I could be in different places at the same time and still have a shared whiteboard, that didn't exist at the time. So it was fairly novel in that sense that we had gotten some patents to do that. And I would have looked, we could have partnered with Polycom and other companies that were in the conferencing space to add telepresence the way Cisco did. All right.
Yonald, do you mind if?
Question?
Yeah, a few Zoom questions. One, just as a question on what you meant by bad money.
What do I mean by bad money? Ooh. I would say, and I may have hit this earlier, really, everyone's money is green. So what you really want to find out is, aside from money, frankly, what does an investor bring to the table, right? as I mentioned before, are they going to give you some access to a market? Are they going to help you enrich your management team? Are they going to help you find other members to join your governance or in some other way? Bad money to me, aside from that, would be taking it at bad terms, right? Taking money from investors that might be a little bit more, I don't know what the term is, but a little bit more parasitic in that they're taking advantage of perhaps entrepreneurs that don't know a lot. In fact, it's funny that you mentioned that because we were talking with folks during that summer when we came out of the contest. We were introduced to two people who were really being high pressure about wanting to invest in us and wanted to invest $500,000, but wanted like 3/4 of the company. And we're like, well, that doesn't make sense, right? We're like, oh no, you don't understand all the value we're gonna bring. And we said no, right? To me, that would have been a bad money exercise, right? These are folks who are clearly predatory in their attack, right? And sometimes you do have to worry about that, right? There are folks who are going to be in the orbit of MIT where there are lots of successful people, lots of smart people. Any environment large enough, you're going to find some people in that spectrum are going to be a little predatory. So be careful about that, which is why a community of people is really valuable, right? Because you'll talk about various folks and understand and ask the ecosystem, well, what do you know about these people, right? Are they valuable in that sense? Was there another question? What's funny is I've distilled down a lot of my experience to sort of 3 questions, right? To run a business, right? Are you doing the right thing? Are you doing it well? How do you know, right? One's a question of strategy, one's a question of execution, and the other one is reality check. Do I have a clear picture of, am I pointing the ship in the right direction, right? Are we rowing well in that direction or sailing well in that direction? Do we have to change course, right? And changing course is a question of reading the weather, right? Which is not a perfect science. So how do you know is really a lot about being, in some sense, a good meteorologist from a financial perspective, from a market perspective, right? Is anticipating what's over the horizon that you don't yet see, either from a market perspective or a financial perspective and so on. But I firmly believe that, being humble enough to ask yourself regularly, are we pointed in the right direction, given all the other factors of competition, of the challenges that are intrinsic to your business and the way your business, to your team, at what stage you are, right? And then are you executing well, right? Are you doing the things that you said you want to do in a timely manner and an effective manner, right? And then having the dashboard that supports that decision-making process, right, is really critical, right? So that's my thought. So now the question is, to me, are you ready about being an entrepreneur, right? Many people I've talked to struggle with this question, right? Oh, I don't know. Maybe it's not the right time. I'll go out and work for a few more years. I'll get some more experience, and then I'll go do it, right? Well, what happens? All right, well, you go out, you maybe get married, have some children, get a mortgage, right? Life starts to take on its own momentum, and the risk that you're willing to take on as those life milestones hit you changes the equation, right? So for many of you who I think are, frankly, in school, may not have all those downstream things in life yet on your plate, this may be a really good time to go do that. Now, I'm not saying you can't do it later in life. Of course you can do it later in life. It's just that it's going to make more demands, and you'll have other trade-off issues you got to think through, right? I also want to distinguish, risk and pain. Everyone at MIT can tolerate pain. That's what this place is really good at dishing out from an academic perspective, right? You work really, really hard, right? But risk is another issue, right? Can you deal with uncertainty, right? And sometimes I found there's 2 populations where people don't manage risk well. Government employees don't like risk, right? They often take government jobs because of the stability, right? But also, I find, oddly enough, that engineers are very risk averse. Why? Because we're trained to be risk averse. Our entire job is to design systems that we can predict the outcome of and build systems as well, right? The whole job is to put a rocket in space that stays up, that works, right? It's not about building unrisky things. It's about trying to tame risk, right? So engineers, I find, frankly, are sometimes very risk averse, but don't realize that it's part of their personality. So the ability to manage risk, to be comfortable with a certain amount of now I'm not saying be reckless, but being comfortable with a certain amount of risk is very different than being comfortable with pain, right? Working hard, everyone's gonna work hard. But being able to sleep comfortably at night, knowing that you don't have the answers to things because some of those things are either unknowable or they're not knowable for a period of time, or you just have to make a decision because if you don't, the opportunity might pass you by. Right? So really understanding your own risk tolerance is key, I think, to being an entrepreneur. Question?
I think it's no different, like you won't feel different, like personally.
Well, I'll let you know when I become filthy rich, right? But I mean, there are trade-offs to in your life to become wealthy. You're going to it's not nothing's for free in that sense, right? You're going to have to trade off something, right? It's your time and where you are, right? And so you're going to have to make life choices about, okay, if I'm here, then I'm not with my family, or if I'm doing this, you're going to have more and more demands in your life, which is why a team is important, right? Because hopefully as a team, collectively, you can support one another and move the entity forward, right? Does money buy happiness? I don't know. I think the book has yet to be written on that. I know a lot of really wealthy people who have material wealth, but are they happy? I don't know, right? Sometimes, because if you're really wealthy, everyone wants to beg you for money to either invest in their thing or do some other thing or fundraise or do that. I mean, maybe they're happy. I don't know. But it's not, I have not yet met someone, well, actually, that's not true. I do know a couple people who were very successful and are very, very happy, but I think it's because their core values are what they stuck through regardless of what happened financially, right? It's almost as if the business was an expression of themselves and the business changing who they were as they grew it, right? Very successful entrepreneurs, so.
Yonald, can we do a time check here?
Oh my goodness, I gotta get done. All right, we have a few minutes here. I might race through this, but I'll stick around if folks have some ad hoc questions. What I do want to talk about also is, the risk tolerance aspect, and really, what is your objective, right? As a first-time entrepreneur, is there something that you're absolutely passionate about going out and building out as a product or service and got to get out there? Or, hey, I want to join a team, I want to learn a little bit about the entrepreneurial environment, and then I want to go do my own thing at the next time, right? So understand what you want to get out of that experience as a way to manage risk. You may say, hey, I'm not quite risk tolerant, but if I join a team where other people are, maybe I could learn how to improve on that front and be constructive and be a good member of that team. And again, your approach to building and financing your company should be in line with your individual and collective intentions as a team. All right, let me, I think I talked a bit about this. Yep, I'm gonna, let's skip to this. Oh, wait, this is my reading list. Take a picture of this, because some of these books now are old enough where they're not recommended as much as they used to be. But Only the Paranoid Survive, Crossing the Chasm, Innovator's Dilemma, those are sort of classics. I still think some of these are fun. I also think down here, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. If you haven't read Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, so incredible to understand what it takes to go and to have a highly performing team. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Highly recommend that. And then this is also a good book. It sort of explains term sheets. Alex he was a VC in the Boston area. I don't know what he's doing these days, but good books. All right, I'm going to skip this because we'll talk about this. I usually talk, some people ask me, what's my cheat sheet for writing an executive summary and outlining a plan? It's 7 sentences. I try to describe the market pain. I try to think what my product offering is, right? I try to articulate what the value proposition is. Try to assess its market potential, right? Assess if there's intellectual property, what's the profit model, and what's the team, the people that build it, right? You don't have to be very linear top down, but I think sometimes having a really light outline and starting with a sentence for each of these things and refining that starts to build elements that you feed into an executive summary, into a plan, into a pitch. It's just a way of structuring some of your loose thoughts when you're brainstorming, right? Just a technique that I like to use when I'm evaluating things. All right. I mentioned before, you've got to love risk, right? You have to be more comfortable, just like that CEO who was so upset that I could basically say, good luck, right? May the best man win, so to speak, right? The fact that I could stand up to someone like that, because I wasn't standing up to him, I was just, like I said, the week before, I was in a lab and now I'm talking to this Silicon Valley CEO. I had no idea what the next week for. I was sort of looking forward to what the next week had, right? Just enjoying this unknown of things, because crazy things are happening, but you have to love risk, right? You have to sort of enjoy that ride. Be great is another thing, right? If you're gonna go out and spend all this time and effort, frankly, do something that is worthwhile and do it with a sense of passion and purpose, right? You're all sort of ambassadors for the MIT brand, for those of you who are here, right? Folks have come before you and hopefully are delivering interesting solutions and technology in the world. You should be a continuation of that legacy, right? I firmly believe that. That's why, frankly, you've all come here, and this is an opportunity to express that sense of greatness that each of you individually have and can pursue and make manifest in the world. But be humble, right? I've met a lot of entrepreneurs who get, who love risk, who love the sort of exciting, extreme sports aspect of entrepreneurship, but lose their sense of humility, right? Who they love their product more than they, everyone else's baby's ugly except theirs, right? That kind of thing, right? You got to have some sense of humility, because that will hopefully alert you to blind spots in your own thinking, right? As I mentioned before, right? Are you doing the right thing? Are you doing it well? How do you know, right? Humility at some level is an aspect of asking that third question of yourself. Be collegial, right? Help one another out, right? I can't tell you how many times early on I would meet people who would go to entrepreneurial functions and they go and they have a transactional mindset of, okay, I need someone who can code in Python, and I'm gonna go to this event and I'm gonna try to find a programmer. And they go to everyone, they're sort of trying to go and filter everyone until they've met, oh, you're the programmer, right? Missing out on all the connections that could be forming with other colleagues, right? The network effect works when you meet everyone and you understand what they want and what they're trying to achieve and so on, because you might come into someone else, in contact with someone else, and then be able to, as part of that network, let you know, oh, you were talking about needing a so-and-so or looking for so-and-so. I met someone at this event, right? The network effect works when you invest your time in that network, right? And start making connections on behalf of others, and you see other stuff coming in. That's the real value of being collegial, right? Don't think transactionally, right? Because if everyone operates in the collegial manner, the whole network as a whole, I think, performs tremendously better. And you may feel, well, I don't have anything to offer. You never know. You just never know, right? And then honestly, have fun, right? You're gonna be working hard, taking crazy risks, working long hours, going on the ride of your life. You might as well enjoy it, right? Otherwise, frankly, you're not gonna wanna get up in the morning on some days, right? Have fun, right? And then lastly, enter the contest. It changed my life, it can change your life too, right? And I mean that seriously. I think it's a good milestone for you to test yourself, to figure out what you know, what you don't know, understand where some of your gaps are. As I mentioned, I entered once and then 3 years later again. So it may take it's not whether you win or not, it's really frankly, are you improving your own understanding and your own capabilities through the competition, right? This gives you something tangible to work toward and measure yourself and measure your own improvement. And I greatly recommend everyone enter the contest with, enter a plan and get some feedback, right? And who knows, you might connect with a judge or connect with someone who may have a similar idea or may want to mentor you or may want to, frankly, be a customer to what you're doing. You just never know, right? You won't know until you sort of get in there. And then, if you want, please email me. This is my email address. If you put nuts and bolts in the subjects, I will do my best to try to reply. I do get a lot of email. Oh, my website's down, so that's not right anymore. I think what I'd like to do, honestly, is find the next person who's going to be giving this talk, right? Which is going to come from people in the audience, right? This talk is good, but it would be great if we could get more people who, as they graduate from this class and go out in the world and put these ideas into practice, that you're up here telling your story and imparting, what you're learning. And it'd be great, maybe we'll start a LinkedIn alumni group from this class, and we'll move that forward, right? So that we can put this idea of being collegial and being great and being supportive. We haven't done it in the past, but maybe it's something that we should do, right? So again, if I can be of help with folks, please contact me. Please put nuts and bolts, because you'll get through my spam filter that way. And really, that's it. Hope you got something out of the class.
Yonald, it's
Ooh, it is late.
every year, the lessons you have here, I don't know if they really appreciate it, but thank you very much.